It's time to expose the Rothschild empire because it's the last days empire, friends. I mean, this is it. Everything is cascading down on our heads. Banking cartels, smashing their opponent banks and taking them over, ending the lives of really American brand name corporations, General Motors and others, smashing American social mores, bringing us a whole new way of life in America, destroying our Constitution. And I'm afraid, and this is one of the questions I'm going to ask Mr. Piper, I'm afraid we're going to see what happened with the Armenian genocide and the Soviet genocide, the Red Terror, happen in America, and it's being brought on our heads by the Rothschilds. And this book, The New Babylon, gives you an understanding. Now, here's the whole key of this. Daniel 12, verse 10 of the Bible, God said that his saints would understand the events of the last days, said the wise shall understand. Wise because God gives us information. Otherwise, we perish, the Bible says. But the wicked, the Bible says, shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. So we have millions of evangelical Christians assisting the satanic Zionists and the Rothschilds and the Obamas to do their dirty work, and they're going to kill us, I believe that, and think that they're doing God a service. In fact, that's what Jesus said in the last days. They will kill you and think they do God's service, and truly they do their God's service. That is the grand architect of Freemasonry. We're talking about Lucifer, or Satan, the god of the Rothschilds, the god of Obama, the god of George W. Bush, by the way. So I want to introduce to you Michael Collins Piper, the author of The New Babylon. Michael, welcome to our program today.
Tex, it's a real pleasure to be back on this program. I know you have a lot of listeners who've been reading my books. I get letters from them, letters and emails from them all the time. So I know then that there's a lot of people out there who are listening to your program. And I want to tell you something, Tex. You mentioned to me before we came on the program, you wanted to ask me about the origins of my book. That's a very interesting question, a key question, a pointed question. Now, as you pointed out, there's been a lot written about the Rothschilds over the years. Now, as far as I'm concerned, there are two key books about the Rothschilds that, if anybody wants the story about the Rothschilds, they've got the story right there. Number one of those books was written by the late Arnold Lease. He wrote a book back in the 1930s, a very small book entitled Gentile Folly, The Rothschilds. But of more recent date, the far more important book on the topic is a book that you published, Synagogue of Satan, by Andrew Carrington Hitchcock.
Oh, yes.
And for anyone who wants to know the history of the Rothschild family, it's right there in that book. Now, despite the fact that these books have already been out there, I wrote this book, The New Babylon, for a very specific reason. In my previous book, The New Jerusalem, Zionist Power in America, I focused on the facts and the figures about the reality of Zionist power in America. But it just kind of presented the reader with the current day situation, but didn't really explain how it came to be. Now, part of the reason then that I wrote The New Babylon was that I felt that the reader needed a historic overview of how things came to be as they are in the United States today and in the world. But more importantly, in this day and age of the Internet, I have detected that there are a lot of people, and Tex Mars is not among them. You have been up there in the forefront telling the people the facts, the historical facts, the religious facts, the philosophical facts about the nature of the New World Order. But unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there on the Internet and publishing small newspapers and magazines who are not telling the whole story. And I said to myself, okay, somebody needs to write a book telling the whole story and putting it all together in a framework that makes sense. So while, in fact, my book does focus on the Rothschild Empire, and its power, the nature of its power in America today. And much of what appears in the New Babylon previously appeared in the New Jerusalem. This book takes it much, much further, and in several hundred more pages goes back to the days of Babylon during the so-called Jewish captivity, when the Jewish people formulated the Talmud. And the Talmud, in fact, remains to this day the real framework for the Jewish religion and for the Jewish ideology of Zionism. But it goes a little deeper than that. We have to recognize that what we have often referred to and what we've heard referred to as the New World Order actually has its origins in the Babylonian Jewish Talmud. In the Talmud and in other writings that emerged in the Jewish world, they made it very, very clear that their ultimate game plan, their ultimate goal, was what one writer, a Jewish writer, referred to as a Jewish utopia. And what we're referring to here in this Jewish utopia is no less than what we know of as the New World Order, a global imperium, a global plantation in which the Jewish people reign supreme and all non-Jews are basically slaves. Maybe I shouldn't say basically slaves, are slaves. Those who stand in opposition to this New World Order, this Jewish utopia, are scheduled to die. These are the people who are called in the Jewish writings the unrighteous and the wicked. Now, we have the Rothschild empire in existence, but the Rothschilds didn't really formulate their financial empire until the end of the 18th century. Now, my book makes this clear, that in the years leading up to the end of the 18th century, there were many very powerful Jewish financial interests assembling vast power and influence throughout Europe. And as a consequence of that, they played a major part in European expansion into Asia and Africa and even into Latin America. However, it was the rise of the House of Rothschild that actually consolidated Jewish power. The Rothschild empire rose to gigantic preeminence. And as a consequence of that, beginning in the late 18th century, but by about 1830 roughly, the Rothschild family became the richest family on the face of the planet. And a simplistic way of putting it is this. During that time frame, they largely consolidated their power in London, in the banking center known as the City of London. But they also had banking houses in other major countries in Europe, which were also beginning to establish their own empires. But at the same time, behind those national empires were the banking houses of the Rothschilds and satellite Jewish banking houses that saw the Rothschilds as more or less the senior partner. Now, everybody talks about the British Empire, but I always waggishly call it the Yiddish Empire, the Rothschild Empire. And of course, the United States was a colony of the British Empire, and what a lot of people don't realize, and I point this out in the New Babylon, that the Rothschilds began their move onto American soil back as early as the days of the establishment of the First National Bank of the United States. And their power continued to expand in the United States to the point that what we know as some of these great white Anglo-Saxon Protestant fortunes were actually only people who were essentially acting as fronts for the Rothschild Empire. These people weren't Jewish. Many of them were nice Episcopalians and Presbyterians and and other religions. But the Rothschild tentacles were already expanding through the United States. And it's my contention, and I think the current day reality of the situation we have in the world today demonstrates that the Rothschilds have so consolidated their power that if they are not in complete control of the United States, they have their hands on the levers of power in all areas of the United States. And here's another point that needs to be made, that as a consequence of their getting this power, they have used it in an insidious fashion. They're using the United States. For years and years, people were worried about the United Nations being the force that would take over the United States, that somehow the United Nations would take over the United States. But no, what we have now is that the United States is being used by the international Rothschild Empire, which controls the American economy through the Federal Reserve System, which controls the American political system through their domination of a tightly controlled national media complex. They're using the United States to enforce a new world order at the expense of the American treasury and at the expense of the American boys and girls who are going off to fight wars in the Middle East for Israel and really occupy the whole world. Another one point that I'd like to make, if I could, Tex, it's this. And I've heard this said on the Internet. I hear people say this. I hear people say, oh, well, the Rothschilds really aren't Jewish. Well, first of all, let me say this. The Rothschilds are Jewish. They're a very, very closely knit family, and they have intermarried with other wealthy Jewish families. And the Rothschilds are devoted to the religion of Judaism. In fact, an early admirer of Meyer Rothschild, the founder of the dynasty, wrote, Meyer Rothschild was a zealous believer in the Talmud and chose it alone as the guiding principle of all his actions.